Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, today we're going to talk about decoupling. That might not be a word that many of you have thought about as leaders, but we think it's really important, particularly important. We're going to focus this entire episode on the idea and the execution of decoupling, something that is going on, something that leaders need to be aware of. Its impact and importance cannot be understated. So here we go. We're going to talk about decoupling. What is it? Why it is so important to leaders? And then we're going to go on to a series of questions. I'm going to read from a number of articles, a broad spectrum of articles, to talk about how this idea, this notion of decoupling manifests itself. So again, several examples will be given. And then concluding, we're going to talk about the consequences to decouple or not to decouple. What can be the consequences depending upon which path you as a leader choose? So that's how the episode will conclude. But let's begin with a quick review of two really important leadership core competencies. These are those arrows in our quiver as leaders that we have with us, available to us, and we may need to literally and figuratively draw upon. So, two quick leadership core competencies as we discuss decoupling. One, situational awareness, knowing what is going on around us. Not just having an idea, but really mindfulness and awareness. To have eyes wide open and heads wide open so we know the environment that we are leading. And second, positional awareness. Where am I in all of this? Where are you in all of this? What position can I take? Should I take? When, how, where, why? All those questions that you in your position as a leader needs to be, again, mindful and aware about. So situational awareness and positional awareness, really key and critical leadership core competencies to really have in that quiver, that arsenal for you as you go forward. These things are easy to say, but really often very complicated and very nuanced to fully grasp. So let me not understate this. This is a challenge, a perhaps large challenge, to really get the ideas of situational awareness and position awareness. Do not fluff it off. Do not shrug your shoulders. These really are important and, in fact, critical. Okay, so I mentioned several questions here in the opening. Let's go right to them. And I'll follow through just in the order that I mentioned them at the intro. Decoupling. Well, we've talked a little bit about what it means. Literally, Webster's defines decoupling as to eliminate. Well, that could be a little harsh, but that's what Webster says, to eliminate. Oftentimes it's discussed in terms of separation, and or reversal, a change, of course, if you will. Generally, though, decoupling means this separating or disconnecting two or more things that were previously linked. Now, that sounds sort of generic, sort of vanilla. We're going to get more detailed about what that really means. But the point is it can apply all kinds of ways, all kinds of contexts. Things like finance, economics, software, even personal relationships. I'm going to go on and talk about here in just a minute other things, institutions, belief systems. We'll talk about religion as well. Okay, In organizational studies, certainly decoupling has taken on an increasingly important role, and in particular, it's that separation again of policy and practice. We may have a particular policy. We do this or we don't do that. But what's the practice? Creating and maintaining separation between formal policies and the actual implementation of a practice. These could be separating. They could, in fact, be decoupling. Okay, so I mentioned this, and certainly I mentioned religion. Let me just touch on that very quickly, and we'll get to some of these articles, because this idea of decoupling is certainly a leadership point of view, but not leadership just in the economic or business sense. It is pervasive across our lives. Let me talk about this idea of religion, which we don't think of in a business context often, but it really is this pervasive notion. What do we see in the case of decoupling of religion? Well, today in the United States, we see fewer and fewer people regularly attending church services of whatever faith, whatever religion, whatever belief. And this is in itself a way to say they are decoupling from a religious or a spiritual life, from a commitment to that life, from following these practices of whatever church it may be. Lots of reasons for that, and we'll get to it. Certainly previously I've done podcasts on the Catholic Church, the problems that they have had historically and ongoingly, stomp my foot there, ongoingly, with sexual abuse. And this is a tragedy, completely inconsistent with Catholic beliefs, completely inconsistent with religious beliefs of any kind. And yet what the leadership has done is to decouple from those beliefs, from those moral codes, those moral imperatives, and for decades go through a system of moving priests, religious brothers, whomever, in leadership positions around, sort of like hide the ball. A very much decoupling from the real core beliefs of Catholicism. And leadership's role has been purposeful and intentional to do that. And yet it would hold a parishioner, a believer, a follower to a higher standard. So, business for sure, government, politics, economics for sure, but it is pervasive across a broad range of institutions as well. All right, first article from the Harvard Business Review. It's an article called "The Strategic Challenges of Decoupling." It's by J. Stuart Black and Alan J. Morrison. They talk at length about decoupling, obviously, and the strategic challenges in this article, beginning with U.S. politicians and the public. They use this historical context. Shortages of N95 masks and other key medical equipment at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis highlighted just how dependent the United States had become on production in China. The Trump administration's aggressive policy toward China was broadly popular. Well, what happened? They began to ask business leaders, said, we need these. It's critical to have a mask during this pandemic that we experienced. Most executives don't want to decouple. That was the end result of those discussions, and it's easy to understand why. As one told us, this is quoting from the article, we spent 13 years getting into China. It's impossible for us to just pull out, end quote. That view's common. No executives were met that were interviewed for this article. You want to see that time and effort and investment they put into developing a presence in China go to waste. More recently, in the case of tariffs, we've heard discussions about the percentages, and we'll talk more about that here shortly. But one leader of a corporation said, these tariffs might cost me $500 million, a substantial amount of money. But to close the plants, move the plants back to the United States, repatriate that business, to build the factories, to get the people, to train the people, would likely cost me $2 billion, talking about his industry. And so he said 500 million or 2 billion, not to mention the time commitment that it would take to realize that repatriation of manufacturing. And he says 500 billion is a far better deal. So you have reluctance on people to decouple. Let's talk about the other side. Let's talk about China. Widely publicized for its sort of tit-for-tat exchanges over tariffs in the years, certainly most recently, have reinforced the popular view in the United States that decoupling largely involves discouraging imports so as to safeguard, or again, the word I've used before, repatriate U.S. jobs and ensure the safety and security of America's civil and military infrastructure. From the Chinese perspective, however, decoupling is a strategic shift whereby China switches its focus from economic growth to economic control. Huge, huge awareness issue, as I mentioned from the very beginning, that you as leaders, we all as leaders, need to be mindful about this shift in focus from economic growth to economic control by China. To that end, China is pursuing 3 objectives. This is from the article, quoting, 1, eliminating its dependence on foreign countries and corporations for critical technology and products. 2, facilitating the domestic dominance of indigenous firms. And 3, leveraging that dominance into global competitiveness. There's this other term, dual circulation, that's discussed, I guess, more currently, and it's used to refer to each of these objectives, all 3 of them, with the first 2 considered internal and the second external. But the point here is that China's vision, their strategic goal, is far, far different than the U.S. and the West. The implications for foreign enterprises are staggering. For example, here we go, U.S. company, Intel, says that they export billions of dollars worth of microchips to China, whose markets account for about 50% of global semiconductor demand. Think about that. Decoupling, impact upon the semiconductor industry, hugely important. And again, these are not one variable equations. There's many, many variable equations. And so what we have to do is, again, be situationally aware and positionally aware about how that would affect you. All right. Today, from the Global Post, let me quote this article. Going a-courting, it's called. Going a-courting. China woos neighbors to beat the U.S. trade war. Let me read just a piece of this article from Global Post today. Chinese leader Xi Jinping took his first overseas trip this year, arriving in Vietnam on Monday. I'm recording this, by the way, today on Wednesday. So just 2 days ago, before heading to Malaysia and Cambodia for meet and greets with Southeast Asian leaders. The long-scheduled trip was aimed at discussions on investment and infrastructure, and also to remind China's smaller neighbors who the heavyweight in the region is. That's a quote. Instead, in the wake of steep U.S. tariffs imposed on China, the trip turned into a charm offensive to woo these countries into deepening their relationship with China in order to isolate the United States. Talk about China's vision, strategic goal in decoupling. That would be it. Quote, "The fact that Xi Jinping is coming to visit these countries is very significant," Lynette Ong, professor of Chinese politics at the University of Toronto, told Bloomberg. "I want to read it as Xi's attempt to form alliances to fight back against the United States in the trade war." Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump rattled the markets worldwide when he imposed steep tariffs on U.S. trading partners around the world, and then pausing most tariffs for 90 days. He instead raised levies on China to 145% to push the country after it retaliated by hiking tariffs on U.S. goods. The trade war and tariffs, despite the reprieve, have left Southeast Asia rattled. All three countries face steep tariffs. Vietnam, 46% tariffs, Malaysia, 24%, and Cambodia, 49%. As a result, the three nations, which have long tried to balance their relations between China and the U.S., face an impossible choice. Cut off trade with one of their biggest trading partners, China, which is to say decouple from China, or face tariffs that could cripple their development. So, strategy, situational awareness, position awareness, hugely important as we begin to understand how this decoupling notion can affect trade and trading partners. Okay, so let's go to another example here in the U.S. Let's answer that question from the beginning. So what happens to U.S. companies? This is just one example, of which the list is going to be very, very lengthy. Here we go. This is from Aviation Week and the Aviation Daily. It's part of the Aviation Week Intelligence Report, written by Jens Fluto, and it's dated April the 15th. The Chinese government has blocked its airlines from taking delivery of Boeing aircraft and U.S.-made aerospace equipment, according to a Bloomberg report. The decision, which comes after the U.S. imposed these high tariffs on goods imported from China as part of President Donald Trump's global trade policy, shows how Boeing and major U.S. aerospace suppliers are in an escalating conflict. According to Aviation Week, Boeing aircraft are due to be delivered in the Chinese airlines in 2025 in the following numbers: 44 this year. Most of them are 737-8s, but Boeing is also planning to hand over 4 777 freighters and 3 787, that's the Dreamliner, to the Chinese carriers this year. Well, folks, this goes on and on about the implications. I'm talking about large companies, but the number of small businesses that do trade globally. And these trading partners are going to have to decide whether they continue that relationship with the U.S. manufacturer, or to decouple and to align themselves more with China. This is going to become huge. So we've talked about some big companies, Intel and Boeing. We've talked about things that are pervasive at institutions, decoupling within the United States, an institution, for instance, like religion. Let's conclude by talking about academia and what it means. I'm going to go to the Harvard Gazette. Now, many people know that Harvard has stood up against these challenges by President Trump to effectively stop the funding of research, to control the content, the curriculum, the faculty, the makeup of the student body of academic institutions. This piece from the Harvard Gazette today is called "This is Weakening the United States." Several people are quoted. I'm only going to do one person, senior fellow. His name is Andrew Tyree. He is the senior fellow at the Masavar Ramani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School, former member of the House of Commons in the British Parliament, and a current member of the House of Lords. So here we have an international perspective from someone who really does get it. Here's the quote. And of course, as a non-U.S. citizen, obviously member of the House of Lords, he's a member of the British citizenry. I am concerned about the wider effects on the world, both the prospects for growth and prosperity, but also for its security and stability. Now, these are a short, simple sentence, but we're talking about, folks, the security and stability of our world. Back to the quote from Mr. Tyree. What I'm not asking is for people to speak up in the interests of the world, but to speak up in the interests of the United States of America. This is weakening the United States and imperiling the prosperity and security of millions of Americans. So, folks, that is the final question raised in the beginning, the answer. The consequences of decoupling in a global world, in a global economy, in global trade, on and on and on, are adverse, are negative. If there was a strategic benefit because of a abuse in a particular product with a particular company at a particular time, then absolutely the leader needs to be mindful and aware of that situation and deal with it. But to take this large hammer, as Elon Musk has shown visually, a chainsaw to institutions, to corporations, to employees, and certainly in this global context, to trade. Wow. Decoupling is something that we as leaders all need to be mindful of and to make sure that we are incorporating in the practice of our leadership. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly appreciate it. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.